Mean by God, Gene! It's the Rolex wearing, diamond ring wearing, limousine riding, jet flying, kiss stealing, wheeling dealing son of a gun. It's the best thing going today, so learn to love it. Well, today, obviously, I am out in the middle of the snow acting like a madman because we are here to pay tribute to the greatest wrestler of all time, the greatest performer. I liken him to the Elvis Presley of the wrestling world, the great, the champ, Ric Flair, the nature boy. Nate! Woo! You know, and I say Elvis because he really does have the Elvis, you know. Elvis was a guy that people were just drawn to. They didn't know why. They had to know what he was doing, and he did crazy things, and Ric Flair was that and a whole lot more. We are going to today find out the story of how Ric Flair became the nature boy here in Edina, Minnesota. Daze with Jordan the Lion, it begins right now. Now, Ric Flair was actually born on February 25th of 1949. He was born in Memphis. He was a black market baby. I was really surprised to find that out. And what that meant was that he was born to, in those days, there was a company, it was called the Tennessee Children's Home Society, and they would basically help women that were unwed or poor, uneducated to deliver their babies. Unfortunately, there was a scam going on when this happened, and a lot of those women were told that their children had been, well, they basically died stillborn, were given papers to sign, and they thought their children died, and they were actually signing adoption papers. And this happened for like 5,000 children before it was discovered, and Ric was one of these. So Ric's birth name was Fred Phillips. His mother and father, on the paperwork for the adoption that Ric had, he actually had the paperwork his whole life and never bothered to look at it until he was writing his own book. He just said it was just, you know, he was happy with the parents he ended up with, never really saw any reason to dive into that. But when he did look at the papers, he found out that it was stated that he was abandoned and his parents gave him up. So the parents that ended up adopting him, the Flairs, they were people that couldn't have children. So unfortunately, Ric's parents had had a child, a daughter, before Ric, and she passed away, and they had continued to try and just were not able to have children. So they went to this organization and they adopted Ric Flair, changed his name, and he became Ric Flair here. And I'm going to show you where he grew up. So this modest house right here in Edina was Ric's childhood home. His father was a doctor. He was studying to be an OB/GYN when Ric was delivered to them in Detroit. That's where he was studying his practice at first. The family immediately moved to Edina and moved into this house. His mother was very highly educated. She used to write for magazines and newspapers, and in fact had written a book about a historical theater here in Minneapolis, the Guthrie Theater. So they were very educated, and Ric was their only child, so they gave Ric everything in life that you could want. As Ric would say, though, he just said they came from completely different worlds. His parents, they loved theater. His father, like I said, was an OB/GYN, but he also went back to school and got his doctorate and master's in theater and English both. And so he would spend, you know, quite a bit of his time traveling on the weekends doing theater performances and things like that. So Ric would have a lot of time where he said he had more leniency growing up than most kids because his parents were doing other things and they would have family friends come watch him, and he said that was always no problem for him to get around because he was always a pretty smooth talker. He was always slick Ric, like we would know. Yeah, he said he was always like that. The guy that we see on TV, he was always like that. He said he never had problem making friends. He was always the life of the party. People always wanted to be around him. Girls, even in elementary school, wanted to be around him. And when he'd go to parties, they wanted to be around him. And he was always a little bit of a troublemaker. He said he never got into fights or anything like that, but he loved sports. He played sports and everything. And I know this for sure is Ric's house because when I met up with him, the last time I met up with him, I asked him, and he was telling me where he went to school. He said, I went to Golden Valley Elementary. And then I said, you know, I have a feeling I know where your house was. And I told him the address. He said, yeah, that was my parents' place until my sophomore year when they shipped me off to be somebody else's problem. So the reason I double checked with him was because I was kind of surprised knowing that his father was a doctor and everything, that this would be their house, but apparently his parents were very frugal, and even though they had money, they didn't believe in showing it off or wasting it or anything like that, which was exactly opposite of Ric. But Ric loved sports, and he played sports while he was here, and also got into wrestling, and that was a big thing for him. He said he loved watching the Crusher on TV doing promos, and he would call his dad in there and say, Dad, watch this guy talk, you know, watch this interview. And he said his dad would watch it and then like walk away and start laughing at how like ridiculous it was. But since he knew Ric loved that, he would take Ric every year on his birthday to see the wrestling matches. And Ric said they would have 2 celebrations a year. They would have a birthday celebration, and then they would have an anniversary celebration where they would go out to an Italian restaurant, and that's where they would celebrate the adoption day. Now, Ric said he loved to, you know, test the waters. He was always doing something, and he got into a little bit of trouble. So the first time he got into trouble was he and his buddy, he had a buddy named Piper, and they stole a car and went out joyriding in it in weather like this, and the engine block froze up because they turned the air conditioner on instead of the heater. And then he got in trouble again because he borrowed his dad's car from this house and knew some of the girls from school were having a pajama party, and he and his buddy went over there, coaxed some of the girls to come out into the car with him, and one of the girls accidentally hit the brake with her foot. A police officer driving by saw the brake go on, started looking into it, got the girls out of the car, the girls had to call their parents, and the parents decided they wanted to press charges. So Ric was taken to the police station, and his father had to come and bail him out. And Ric said, when my dad got there, I said, Happy Father's Day, Dad, because it was Father's Day morning. He said, thanks, Ric. Now, like I said, Ric said he had a dream childhood. There's nothing he could ask for more. You know, he said they basically gave him anything he could have wanted, treated him great and everything. And his parents just, you know, they genuinely, for the rest of Ric's life, would help him out in any situation, except for when Ric decided he wanted to become a wrestler. He asked for a loan from his dad, and his dad said, why would I do that? That's just a big waste of money. So now we're heading a couple of blocks away to Lake Edina. So now we're currently looking down on a frozen Lake Edina, and one of Ric's other times of getting in trouble was this lake. He was stopped, at least, by police because he was underage riding a motorcycle. He had his family's Honda 50 and he was out riding it around the lake and had no license. So basically, after, you know, enough of these things had happened, Ric's parents just decided it was a little more than they could take, and they decided to send him off to a boarding school in Wisconsin. So when Ric told me they shipped him off to be somebody else's problem, that's where it was. They sent him to a boarding school, and he said, you know, when he first got there, he said they had a great academic program. If you were going there for that, you really would get your money's worth. But some of the other kids were mainly like him. They were kids that came from families that had a little bit of money, and they were a little bit of a problem. And so Ric said it only took him a few weeks to realize he was in heaven. This was his kind of place. It was co-ed. He lettered in 3 sports. He did shot put, he played football and wrestling, and he was actually the state wrestling champ for the private schools in the state of Wisconsin. So he made a really good friend there named the General, and the General had a pretty wealthy family. And so Ric said a lot of the kids would go home every other weekend to visit their families, but once he met the General, he would go to the General's family's home, and the General was super wealthy. And Ric said that's when he got his taste for the finer things in life, because he said, were like one of the wealthiest families in the whole Midwest. Every time Ric was doing something, the General was involved. When spring break would come around, Ric would go back home here to Edina, tell his folks that he wanted to go stay with a friend, and they would take him to the train station. He said he would hitchhike all the way to Fort Lauderdale to hang out with the general and to pick up girls. So one of the summers that Ric came home, he got a job as a lifeguard here in Edina, and he started naching. He apparently a married woman there started to like him, and her husband traveled a lot and he was never around, so she started sleeping with Ric. And then when he went back to private school, one day he shows up at the school and they say, hey, your aunt drove 300 miles to see you. He walks in the office and there she is, and he took off with her. And apparently her conscience got to her, because one day he said she went to her doctor and confessed to her doctor that she was having an affair with a minor. And the doctor went and told his partner, which also happened to be Ric's father. So needless to say, Ric's father was not happy about that and told Ric to quit sleeping with his patient. So when Ric finally finished high school, he said it took him 5 years. He said even though his grades were really bad, or pretty bad, he said colleges were interested in him because he was a state wrestling champion and a good football player. So he actually went and toured Michigan, University of Michigan, and he's a huge fan of them even to this day. And they offered him somewhat of a scholarship, I believe, but he had to have his principal state that the principal believed that Ric could excel and he could keep up with the work and everything, and the guy just flat out refused to do it. And Ric said he was totally right, I never would have been, but I was hoping he'd do me a solid. So instead, Ric went to his parents' alma mater at University of Minnesota, and they were going to give him a scholarship also, but they said you couldn't give anybody a scholarship their freshman year, it had to be the second year, and Ric's grades were bad the first year, so they said he had to do summer school. He went to 2 weeks of summer school, took off with the general and didn't come back, and basically had to leave school. He said he started selling insurance and was pretty good at that, but then he was bouncing one night at a bar and saw Ken Patera come in, and that's what changed his life. He decided, or was talked into, going to Vern Gagne's wrestling school, and the rest was history.
Oh! That's what I do in the morning when I kick 5 girls out of bed. I go, woo! And they go, woo, woo, woo! Because they know they've been with the world champion.
Now I absolutely am going to come back someday and do continuation vlogs about where he worked and all that stuff, and where he trained and did the wrestling and everything. But I thought this was a good start with showing his childhood home, and because the day after Christmas they're going to be releasing his documentary on Peacock, Becoming Ric Flair, and he's so proud of this, and he said this is the most accurate thing that's ever come out about him. I thought, you know, I would give you a little introduction. If you want to know more, please go over to Peacock and watch the Ric Flair documentary. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time. Have a great night, and goodbye.